Hello, my name is Ryan Hood, and this is my Lucidchart vulnerability presentation. So there's lots of things that contribute to vulnerability. We've got rural and migrant health, which leads to vulnerability. Rural and migrant health is also associated with poverty, which is associated with vulnerability. Rural health, we've got an explosion of a meth epidemic and a opiate epidemic that is ravaging our rural communities, and that is leading to addiction, which leads to vulnerability. Also, addiction and poverty can both lead to homelessness, which leads to vulnerability. Homelessness also leads to infectious diseases, which leads to vulnerability. Homelessness can also lead to violence, which leads to vulnerability. So we've also got the problem of mental illness, which can lead to violence, although I should say that being mentally ill does not necessarily incite one to violence more so than usual. However, being mentally ill makes one more likely to be a target of violence. And so that's why that's in there. And that, of course, leads to vulnerability. Mental illness and addiction. Addiction is a mental illness, and mental illness can be self-treated by addictive substances. So those two interplay, and the end result is vulnerability. And of course, addiction can also lead to homelessness, which leads to vulnerability, or which leads to infectious diseases, which leads to vulnerability, or which leads to violence, which leads to vulnerability. And let's see here. Addiction, if just by itself, again, can lead to violence, which leads to vulnerability. Addiction can lead to homelessness, which leads to vulnerability. Addiction can lead to homelessness, which leads to violence, which leads to vulnerability. Addiction can lead to infectious diseases, which leads to vulnerability. Or addiction can lead to homelessness, which leads to infectious diseases, which leads to vulnerability. Violence. If someone is a target of violence, then they are vulnerable. If someone is just without any other preceding factors homeless, then they are at risk for infectious diseases, which leaves them vulnerable. If someone is homeless, then that puts them at more of a risk for violence, which makes them vulnerable. And finally, if someone has an infectious disease, in the absence of any other preceding factors, they are vulnerable. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.